I have found in my lived and professional experience that being a queer person of color, it's so easy to be labeled when you think differently or expect differently or have a higher standard as being difficult, as being a troublemaker, as being any number of things that we really don't want to be labeled. And that same energy with other people who were in our circles was applauded as radical thinking, rebel leadership, all of these things.
This is Innovation Currency. My name is Leigh-Ann Buchanan, and I am your host. What I want this podcast to help people see about themselves is that innovation is for everyone, and everyone is an innovator. I developed a simple test, a quiz, if you will, to help anyone discover their hidden innovation traits from across 4 specific domains: disruptor, connector, distributor, and influencer. If you haven't already taken the quiz, please stop, take a pause, and go by visiting my website, www.leannbuchanan.com/innovator quiz.
I know both of you. You both know each other, which is a welcome surprise. But why don't we get started by maybe introducing who you are? So just name and then how you describe yourself to the world.
I'm Dejha, and I describe myself as just an arts advocate, somebody who gets behind ideas, who keeps her community close, and who likes to uplift the people around her.
My name is Corey. My pronouns are he and they. I don't think that I give much thought about what I describe myself as to the world, because often I find that the world has its labels for me, and I just contend or contest those.
All right, well, let's just get started about labels. So one of the labels that I want to talk about today is the idea of who is an innovator and how we might identify with that term. And so why don't we start off with you, Corey, since we got on the topic of labels. How do you define innovator?
I think that an innovator is actually a lot more common than what we tend to think about. So with the folks that I work with, some really incredible social impact leaders who are queer and trans people of color, what we have come to find is that innovation happens every day as almost necessity. Because when we think about the systems and structures that were created with us not in mind, in order to thrive, in order to survive even, in order to build some sense of resilience, you have to be innovative. We often think of an innovator as a white man behaving badly. That's what I often think of and is celebrated. And really what we think about is that there are people who may never even think of themselves as innovators, who are doing things that are disruptive, that are creative, that add value, that are a different take on every aspect of their life on a daily basis, just so that they can make space to exist in the world.
I love it. Dejha, how do you define an innovator?
I mean, I start with thinking about imagination as a radical act of freedom. And for me, the freedom to imagine is the freedom to innovate. It's the freedom to be able to see tomorrow, to see what you don't have today in a different space, in a different context. And so I would agree with Corey in that it's in all of us. But the question is, do we have the courage and the conditions and the support system to be able to see ourselves first as innovators and then go out and do the innovating?
I feel like there was a mic drop. So Dejha, are you an innovator?
I am.
And then since you do identify, because not everybody has gotten there yet, I can tell you personally, like I struggle with calling myself an innovator. Yet maybe externally people might say, oh yeah, no, for real, Leigh-Ann, you're an innovator. But I don't feel comfortable calling myself yet that. So I'm curious, Dejha, if you can explain, when did you know you were an innovator and how did you know?
It's interesting because for me, I started understanding that I was an innovator when people weren't agreeing with me, or when people were telling me that I was on my own path and that I didn't know what I was talking about. or when I felt like often I was the first out on something and not everybody was following, but maybe they would a few months or a few other successful projects, or after somebody else co-signed or validated it who didn't look like me. So I first started thinking of myself as an ideas person. And then I got into the space of, well, I've got vision. And then I started understanding that I was an innovator after I started putting those ideas and that vision into practice. And so it was after, I would say, feeling sometimes alone or feeling misunderstood, but then pursuing nonetheless because of the support of my community and folks who did believe in me, that I started seeing that, my ideas could mean something, and they could mean something in collaboration with other ideas, and that together we would be able to achieve things. And so it wasn't just I myself as the innovator, but we as innovators. And I'm a part of that too.
It's interesting. You talk about your innovation identity journey in terms of a collective one, in that it didn't exist or happen in a vacuum, didn't happen in a silo. I think a lot of times when I describe innovation, we think about, business processes, optimization, structural. But I think innovation is inherently a social process. It is something that thrives in trusted spaces. It thrives in collaborative spaces. And I think to some degree, it also thrives in storytelling, which I want to get to all of those points. But before we talk a little bit about those environmental conditions that I think help inclusive innovation happen, or an inclusive identity of who is an innovator occur, Corey, I want to ask you the same question. Are you an innovator?
Yeah.
And then I guess to the same question I asked Dejha, how did you come to that knowledge? Like, what was that journey like for you?
I think it really is just a manifestation of being the only, often being the only fill in the blank of the label in a particular space. And so I really had to come to understand that how I sought validation, what my standard of anything was, is okay to be different, because I was moving from a different perspective. And I really do credit my mother, who was an educator, with being able to give me that sense and to, I think, nurture this sense of having the freedom to fail before we ever thought of that as being a cool, buzzworthy kind of topic. And I think when you have that feeling of support, that ecosystem of support, I think it is that you really do find a way to be innovative, to be creative, to have that ideas and vision. I think out of necessity, out of self-preservation, I had to find that there was gonna need to be a different path that I needed to follow, because the path that little Johnny was available to little Johnny was not available to him. So that's, I think, where that spirit of innovation came from.
And as you think about the social aspect, the relationships, you mentioned your mother, and I think oftentimes those that harness and cultivate our innovation identity start at home, or sometimes those that put up roadblocks and barriers to our innovation identity start at home. But I want to go beyond the familial relationships and try to unpack a little bit the most connected and intimate, deep relationships that have contributed to your innovation experience or your identity as an innovator. Thinking about maybe who is the one person, or at least one person, that has opened up some doors for you, either to learn more about yourself as an innovator or opportunities to innovate? And I know it's a tough question.
I think that the seed was so firmly planted in the family, and I'm sorry, because I always push back when people, oh, my family, my parents, I always think that it's kind of intellectually lazy. But in this perspective, it was already baked in the cake. The idea that my grandfather was somebody who took me to the Guggenheim when I was a very young child and insisted that we would go and learn about different things with different people, taught me French at a very young age. Like, all of these things, even though he picked up French in the army. Like, there's not, you know what I mean? Like a family tradition. So to me, I felt like it was this nurturing that happened, that by the time I got out into the world, it was only natural that I would align and gravitate to other people who had this sense of innovation. Because when you are in a space of onlys, you look for onlys that are a little bit further down the path or that are peers. You lock arms and you're like, okay, I got you, you got me, and you keep going. So it really was, I think, already an expectation. If I had to push and think hard, I would say that what has accelerated that journey in recent years has been some really wonderful program officers and other people who have provided philanthropic support outside of just writing the check, but really coming to understand our program, understand our leadership team and structure, and being with us in a way that said, hey, have you considered just building your own capacity? What would it look like if you just had sufficient support to be able to think and have ideas and experiment and play and take some of these ideas much further? I think that's been crucial, but that has come at a point where we have already demonstrated that we are innovative. Do you see what I'm saying? So it was once we were able to minimize the risk for others that they came and said, hey, be innovative. Well, okay, but when we were innovative, it was 2 years prior to when you're celebrating our innovation. That's when the investment really would have made an even bigger difference for us and those in our community.
And before we go to Dejha to ask a similar question around who has helped you to understand your identity beyond family, if perhaps that's applicable, and open up doors, I just want to draw out something you said, Corey, which is that the relationships that have been able to unlock growth in the innovative space for your work, and presumably you as a person as well in leading that work, came to some degree at a time where you had kind of proven yourself. But importantly, I think what you also shared is they weren't just transactional. It wasn't a exclusive, I give you a check, you give me an outcome, an output, and a great report. It seemed as though, and correct me if I'm wrong, you are cultivating more of a deep intimacy with those philanthropic partners, and also aligning around shared values that is demonstrated in your work. Is that a fair?
I think it's right on. I would say that there's just a little piece before that, and it's an important piece. Before that alignment of values, there's a lot of kissing of frogs. There's a lot of sifting and sorting that has to happen first, okay? And during that period of time, I have found in my lived and professional experience that being a queer person of color, it's so easy to be labeled when you think differently or expect differently or have a higher standard as being difficult, as being a troublemaker, as being any number of things that we really don't want to be labeled. And that same energy with other people who were in our circles was applauded as radical thinking, rebel leadership, all of these things. I feel like the persistence that's required to survive that first phase is then where you are able to get to a place. If you're able to persist, then you find that alignment. But it's not something that the system is absolutely set up to reward and develop.
I love that. Dejha, what about you? The people who have unlocked your innovation.
You know, when I was maybe about 7 or 8 years old, we lived in a small apartment, and my dad turned in one of our bigger closets into a studio space for me, where I had my drafts table, my colored pencils, my Legos, everything that I needed. And so as a child, I had a very rich inner life. And I was the type of kid who'd spend more time in the darkroom than at the cafeteria table. But then I'd want to be on the publicity community, and I started step team at our small private school, and I'd draw the backdrop at the talent show. I was always that person who wanted to be in the background, creating the sets, doing the designing, creating the publicity, and getting behind the folks who I was just really, really excited about. Mm-hmm. And so I would say my friends have lifted me through this space, because before I knew that I was innovating, or before I knew I was creating things, I was really just hanging out with my friends and hanging out with myself. That's what it was. You know, it would be like, oh, let's have a party. Oh, let's make it a theme. Let's put things together. Let's have a program. Before I knew it was programming, it was fun. Mm-hmm. And so I would say some of the first ideas for me, or some of the first forays in that space, came from just having a simpatico relationship with people, and then following them or them following me, and us making things together. I was on one subway ride, I guess it was like my second year of university, and this guy who I always smiled at the Gap, because he was just one of these exuberant, like, just great vibes. Like, the vibes just emanated off of him. And we saw each other at the subway, so we said hello. We don't know each other. And he was just like, hey, you know what? I'm starting this magazine, and they're looking for some folks to write. I don't know if you do any of this, but I just like you. Can we hang out? Would you be interested? I was like, oh, actually, I'm in English. I'm in school. I'm looking for a project. I'm having a hard time finding a job. I need a project. Right. So this idea of making your own mixtape, because you couldn't necessarily find the opportunity out there, was very important. I mean, we ended up putting together a magazine and a fashion show featuring Black artists and designers, because all of us needed an opportunity to be able to talk about in our portfolio.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And so it was that kind of experience that led me to start thinking that I couldn't wait to fit into somebody else's paradigm. I had to start creating these mixtapes, if you will, and these opportunities for myself as ways to leverage my way into other doors and open other doors for other folks.
Your phrase, you could not wait to fit into someone else's paradigm, brings up something interesting for me, in the sense that, and it's also something you said from the outset, which is who we define as an innovator. And part of why I wanted to go on this journey, this experience, this book, was really because I did not see myself reflected in what constitutes the stereotypical innovator. Like, Black woman, recovering attorney, someone that focuses a lot on purpose, impact, and building community really intentionally. Like, that's not who we see on the magazines, on any of these vanity lists, or anybody that's elevated around the narrative more broadly of who is an innovator. And so I guess my question to you both is really, how important has it been for you? And then also, how important do you think it is for others to see themselves reflected in spaces in terms of their status as an innovator, if they either identify with that or if they're doing innovative things? How important do you think that has been for your journey, as well as for other people coming after you? We'll start with you, Dejha, and then go to you, Corey.
It's crucial, it's vital to be able to write our own story and to see ourselves in those stories and expand on those stories. Just so necessary. I mean, there's a long history of storytelling in our community, and often it's a verbal story. But to not see ourselves in the mainstream publications and the mainstream news, it's an act of disinformation and misinformation, as if we don't have our own history, as if we don't have our own stories that also deserve to be elevated and told from our own voices. So I think it's incredibly important to have representation in the space, and not just one kind of representation. You need to have intersectionality. You need to have, we're not just one thing, right? We're many people, we're multiple peoples all in one. So to be able to have that kind of diversity is incredibly vital.
Was there someone for you in particular that you saw that demonstrated, I can do that?
Prince.
Why? But for the people in the back that don't know. But why? But what, like, I want to understand, what is it about, like, being able to see Prince and say, okay, I can do X?
Well, it was more like just seeing the fluidity of Prince, because I grew up in Montreal where there wasn't that many folks who looked or moved like me. And when I got my first subscription to Vibe magazine, the first magazine I got was the one where Prince was on the cover, and he had changed his name to be the artist. And so this idea of, oh, you want to get me into a contract? Well, I'm going to call myself something else. Oh, you want to give me a gender? Okay, well, I'm just going to do whatever I want to do. You want me to play one instrument? Well, I'm a multidisciplinary artist. You want me to dress one way? Well, I'm going to do something else. I'm going to keep on innovating and reinventing myself because I don't believe in time and I don't believe in constructs, and I am who I am. And now I am the artist. I mean, it's just these simple things, right? That clicked with me early on, as in, well, who can tell me what to do? The only people who could tell me what to do are my parents. So that's it.
I love that. Corey, what about you? Same question, I guess. You know, who perhaps in your life was the Prince that said, I can be X part of my identity, I can do X thing? And then why do you believe it's important if that's the truth?
I don't know. I'm having a moment. You know, I remember I saw Prince at Nassau Coliseum live, okay?
Oh.
And my mother and a group of our friends, we had great tickets on the floor right there. And to see Prince come out on stage and then turn around and basically had on these pants that were assless.
The assless straps, yes.
Oh, okay, so we can do that. Like, there was this sense of freedom, you know, that I really enjoyed. I will say that at a very early age, my mother got me a gig working in a corporate office of a very large media company, and the vice president of corporate social responsibility was a Black woman. And she was no nonsense. She gave me my work ethic outside of the family structure. She let me know she was no nonsense, and she was pushing an idea of what corporate social responsibility could be at that time that we now take for granted. And she was in a boardroom of white men. And what she allowed me to do was to be in, I'm talking about 13, be in meetings, took me into the boardroom. So I was able to see the way that she carried herself, the way that she negotiated, and she was so unapologetic. She did not try to be anything other than who she was in that space, and she made everyone else adjust. Took me years to understand that and what was going on. But I think by having those seeds planted at such an early age, when I was old enough to understand and had gotten bruised enough to really finally take the lesson, I have to say that it was so important to be able to see her and the way that she moved and the idea of how power flows and how she was able to bring so many other people along with her through money, through support, through politics, through all of these things. And I think my trajectory would have been completely different if I did not have that degree of mentorship and visibility at such an early age.
Yeah.
I'm an innovator, but if I'm being honest with you, I couldn't always call myself an innovator. I've spent the better part of a decade launching and leading projects designed to help everyday people access their innovation potential. It's included projects that have unlocked over $75 million for things that bridge gaps in access, opportunity, and equity. When I transitioned From being a trial attorney to leading organizations in the innovation space, what I really needed was a guide to help me answer two critical questions. Am I an innovator? And what type of innovator am I? The problem is that our society and our own identity serve as barriers to keep our powerful potential as innovators locked away and hidden. Innovation Currency is the book that is designed to help you discover your hidden innovator. If you've ever wondered what innovation looks like for you, how you might use innovation in your day-to-day life, or how you can use innovation to help solve some of the most pressing challenges in the world, or even your workplace or community, then please grab your copy of Innovation Currency, because I can assure you that after reading it, you'll have the tools, the experience, and the translatable skills to unlock your hidden innovator. To find out where you can purchase your copy in whatever format makes sense for you, scroll down to the show notes for the appropriate links.
In the book, I talk about, as you guys know, it's about different forms of capital that influence our innovation identity, as our identity as innovators. And one of the forms of capital, and I know we've talked about this, is this idea of inspiration capital, that you need to be exposed to people who reflect an element of who you are. That it is so important for the process of developing your identity as an innovator to see yourself, not maybe your whole self, but to have models of elements of your identity, intersectionality, but also something as simple as a Black woman, a Black person in a corporate space. And I think a lot about the work that I do, that we do with youth. And I never realized how important it is for them to see a Black woman leading perhaps the biggest innovation organization, in our community. Or I hate speaking publicly, but every single time I do, I'm like, there may be someone that needs to see this. And so both of you, from Prince to your former boss, I think they really illustrate why it is so important. And sometimes it doesn't hit us till much later in life, how much of an impression and how much that shapes who we ultimately become. So Corey, you were also gonna add in maybe a qualifier to what we just talked about.
I was going to say that you never know exactly who needs that and who needs that kind of being able to see themselves. And if you're able just to create an environment of inclusion, of belonging. When I was in that office, I did not know at the time that I was queer. Mm-hmm. But there was a really wonderful staff member who is an incredible artist who was part of that team and a respected part of that team. He was able to be out. And so later, when I started to understand my own sexuality, there was a normalizing feature that when I came out, it wasn't this huge traumatic thing, not only because my family was tremendously supportive, but I had already seen. Mm-hmm. So when I use my pronouns, I don't just do it when I suspect that there might be somebody who is trans or non-binary in the space, or somebody who does not express their gender identity in a way that might be what I expect. I just do it all the time because we never know how mm-hmm. that's going to land and for whom it might be important.
And that brings up for me something about this innovation conversation, which I wish we talked more about: authenticity, right? And in the book, I talk a lot about your capacity capital, and that has to deal with kind of talents and skills. But I think at the heart of it is having an understanding of your superpowers, right? I like to say, zone of genius, you've heard zone of genius, but what are your superpowers? Because when you get clarity on who you are authentically, and I like to say 3, but what are your top 3 superpowers? When you know that, I think that's where you actually begin to see where a lot of your innovation output actually comes from. And a lot of solidifying of your identity as an innovator comes from that knowledge of who you are, how you can authentically play in those zones. At least for me, I like to say my superpowers are strategy, communication, and connection. And I find I feel the most innovative, and indeed I am, when I'm in those 3 areas. So I guess the questions I have for you guys are, what are your 3 superpowers?
I would say, going back to when you were talking about inspiration capital, I really think the arts for me, and that's why I really spoke about Prince, opened these doors for language that I didn't really have at the time. And so when I think about what my superpowers are, I think it's got to be this place of like curiosity that's also somehow rooted in uncertainty, but not the kind of uncertainty that's debilitating, but the kind of uncertainty that opens more doors for exploration all the time. I am always in a space of transformation. I am always open to thinking differently, to hearing new things, to seeing new things. And I think that my senses, if you will, right, especially through the visual arts for me, and especially through music, keeps me in a state of flux that also keeps me in that creative space. So if I had to distill that into a few words, I would say curiosity, creativity, and strategy.
I love it. Corey, and you're dead on.
Please don't get mad at me.
Have I ever gotten mad at you?
Well, I don't know. If you have, you kept it to. But I will respectfully not answer about superpowers, because one of the things that I do is hold space for leaders. And what we've recognized over really this past year is that in the way that we have been showcasing our leaders, it has created obstacles to entry for other people who are just as gifted. And they say, oh, I could never do that. And I know that what you're getting to is what are our gifts and these types of things. But when we talk about these superhuman things, I have noticed, because we have done that, it has had a chilling effect on our recruitment and people who actually persist in the application process for our program. So for me, I would just say, in terms of the gifts that I've been able to unlock, it has really been this idea that I'm okay holding an uncomfortable position if it means expanding space for other people by not giving a fuck. I feel like, because at a certain point, I am working on issues that are life or death. Certain things have to be said, particularly in the face of white supremacy, particularly in the way that certain trusted institutions have failed us systemically. And when you care about, is it the politic answer? Is it the popular way of going? It will inhibit. So I thank God every day that I'm a Scorpio, and so therefore I, really am okay if you don't like me, because really the purpose is so much greater than some kind of personal relationship. So that's kind of where I come from, I think.
So a Scorpio to 2 Pisces.
I love that you push back. I do think even in your attempt to push back, you articulated so beautifully what I believe your superpowers are, right? Which is, you are so transparent. Like you just have this degree of transparency that forces other people to really reflect on themselves, whether or not you intend to be that way. And I think the other superpower that you have is you are so purposeful. You are so intentional. Even when you speak, I'm always like, because you are so thoughtful and intentional about how you articulate, even when you are calling someone out about their mess, be it on social media or otherwise. And I think, a third, which is what I really appreciate about you, is, as you articulated, your ability to uniquely hold space for folks that do not find respite elsewhere. I've seen you do it with the NIA Fellows, which is why we have you every year come in and do the owning your story. And I think that sometimes when we use the word superpower, I never mean it, and I think you brought up a really good point. It's not intended to push people into a place of deficit. I think the goal of owning your superpower is to push you into a place of seeing opportunity, of digging into yourself. In my meditation, even this morning, you know, my Bible verse for the year was, now unto him who's able to do exceedingly abundantly all that we could ask or think of, according to the power that works within us. And that's the piece that we sometimes forget, that we hold the power. And by owning it and naming it, we're then able to innovate more.
I'm so glad that you said that, because I think that it's not my superpower. For me, I'm able to tap into my faith. That I believe that there is a divine source in the universe that you are able to tap into. Otherwise, it's just too exhausting to hold the space for me. And I feel like whatever it is, whether it's faith or whatever it is, if you're able to tap into something larger to yourself, that's available to everyone. That's the only reason why I push back on the superpower, because I feel like whatever I've been able to harness is from tapping into a larger source, whatever that is, whether it's a cause, whether it is faith, whether it is, you have to believe that there's something bigger in my mind in order to continue to innovate, because it's just too exhausting any other way. It can be overwhelming, it can be scary, it can be all of these things. But when you have something, a purpose that is bigger, it's definitely easier.
And I want to talk for a second about purpose and power, which is two topics that don't often intersect with innovation conversations, but I think they go, you know, so closely together, which is this idea that what is the purpose of the power that exists, that we can hold when we fully step into our identity as innovators. And I think a lot about systemic barriers, and we've talked a lot about these barriers that prevent us perhaps from the privilege of innovation, but also prevent us from really accessing opportunities. And so I guess my question for both of you, and I'll start with you, Dejha, how do you think innovation can really be a tool of systemic change? Or do you?
I do. And I think that when you give or when you help folks have access to tools around learning and exposure, you create healthy conditions where they can start tying their own experiences and relationships to places of change. If people can see themselves as change makers and they have the tools they need to make the changes happen, that's when you create a growth mindset and an innovator mindset. So making sure that we have the conditions. We've talked a lot about community. We've talked a lot about representation. We've talked a lot about access, are really just some of the vital things that you need to be able to cultivate that kind of community and that kind of thinking, I would say. And I think innovation as a word is really interesting, right? Because it's often used and attached to a certain paradigm, a certain type of person or whatnot, right? But it's not a destination. It's always like a journey. I am constantly innovating. It's a practice. It's a practice of thinking. It's a practice of cultivating, of building, of failing, of trying again, of failing again. And so, you know, not thinking of things in such a binary way, but really as a continuum and as a series of relationships, experiences, and learnings, I think is the way that we create fertile ground for innovation.
And as you think about the similar question, you know, how might we wield that power as a tool of change? And ought we?
Always. It always comes back to power. Who has it? Who doesn't have it? How is it flowing? And I think part of the obstacles to innovation is that we do not have authentic conversations about power. It's scary to talk about power. But I think it's the only way that we really can unlock the keys to innovation.
It's interesting. I was listening to a podcast and the host quoted MLK, who said that power is essentially the ability to achieve purpose. and to effectuate economic, social, and political change. And so I think as we kind of round up our conversation, the question that comes up for me is really a fundamental one, which is, why do we need innovators? Why does this world need innovators? And I know you're laughing because I'm gonna go to you first, but really, like, these are questions that we almost take for granted because we, to some degree, are in a little bit of a bubble of innovative people. But as you think about, my goal in these conversations and this written work is to try to make the concept of innovation, of being an innovator, more accessible to more people. So why do we need innovators, or do we?
We definitely need innovators, because I think that we have clearly seen now that the systems and structures and institutions that have the most power in our society have utterly failed in moments of urgency. And so we must start to reimagine how it is that we are in relationship to each other, how it is that we define community, how it is that we advocate for change. And so we must have innovators, because if we don't rethink and chart new paths, then I really am not encouraged about what we can expect in the future. So I really think that that's where we should be putting all of our resources. And as we make a call for innovators, I think we have to examine our biases about who can be an innovator, who has traditionally been celebrated as innovators, and that we have to look at new models of innovation and resilience, and understand how is it that we must create the fertile ground that is necessary for people to really thrive in there and take ownership and stand in their own power as innovators. I think there are really some wonderful models, especially in communities of color, especially in queer communities of color, where people have had to innovate out of necessity, out of survival. And I think that is where, moving forward, we really have to look.
Same question.
We absolutely need innovators. I mean, I think more than ever, folks are looking for liberation. We need freedom. And not everybody has that. Not everybody has access. And until we're all free, it doesn't matter.
Right.
And folks have been innovating for centuries. We just haven't called it that. And so we really need to keep our foot on the gas. And we need to work with each other to make room and lift as many people as possible along the way.
Yeah. I can't think of a better place to adjourn our conversation on this idea that at the heart of this innovator identity is the power to liberate oneself. It is the power to access the tools that perhaps are already within us and around us that we don't necessarily know how to put together. And when we do, that is how, to your point, we wield our own power and effectuate real change in our communities. So thank you, Dejha. Thank you, Corey, for joining me.